There are kind of interesting themes. We mentioned the metaverse, and what fascinates me is I see all these kind of thematic ETFs popping up dedicated to those themes. But you still do, this is partly for liquidity reasons, but you still do see the major tech stocks, the FAANGs or the FAANGs or whatever term you want to use, kind of popping up in those portfolios. And I suppose an interesting point I want to put to you guys is, if we're looking to kind of play these themes, is it actually a good approach to simply back some of the big companies that can, they can put fingers in many of these pies, rather than kind of going for something that is a dedicated metaverse company or, that kind of thing? What are your takes there?
It's a really difficult one, isn't it? Because I think, you actually look at the sheer scale, there's this sort of fear of missing out. I won't abbreviate that, I'm too old. But in terms of the actual, with something like Facebook, or even if let's look at Apple, that's probably the same weighting of the whole of the UK on the MSCI ACWI. So there's almost this kind of, well, how can you possibly ignore that? Because, it's such a tangible thing as well. Everyone carries around an iPhone or whatever. Everyone uses Apple Pay and stuff like that. But, it's so difficult to ignore that kind of that market weighted enormous sort of sway that those guys have. Because actually, you look at the whole entire market, and actually a lot of the sort of the performance, even in the UK, can often be driven by, a difficult period of trading the night before over in the US. And largely, a lot of the time, it's driven by some of those enormous names. So almost it's almost too difficult to ignore and too tempting just to have, a piece of that sort of pie, if you like. So whilst the real sort of next opportunities, etc., may not be those absolutely enormous giants that have already sort of been there and been sort of hovering at the top for a long time, because it'd be difficult for those companies to suddenly reinvent themselves. Although, obviously Facebook is sort of currently trying. It's very difficult also to then the research and the coverage as well, because it's so easy to find news on all of these companies. But, in terms of from a balance sheet perspective, how do you even start on going about trying to value the sort of intellectual property or intangible assets on the balance sheet of some new idea that someone in Silicon Valley's had last weekend? So, it's really, really difficult. Goes back to the valuation piece and trying to understand the business model as well. So much of it now is about things like marketing. And, it was during the glorious days of going onto YouTube or going onto Facebook and not having one advert. That's no longer possible, sadly. So, it's very difficult to ignore those top companies simply because they are the biggest companies out there in the world, really. And they do have a lot of say, and the clout that they carry is obviously quite difficult to ignore. But there will be far more exciting opportunities out there. It's just a case of finding them, and probably ones that are being created as we speak and that we don't know about yet. And that's probably what sets the sector apart from everything else, I think.
Yeah, I think probably sorry, I was going to say that exposure to the sector is probably enough for most retail clients. I wouldn't say trying to find that specific stock, because then as a retail investor, particularly, you're going up against the people who are doing that for a professional living and have analyzed the tech sector for 20 years, or they have one specific stock which they analyze. If you're trying to outperform those people, I think invariably, often you're going to lose unless you're kind of in the GameStop type of stuff. So I think broad exposure to the market is probably safer for retail clients. And if you buy any technology fund, by default, you're going to have a huge exposure to all of the biggest companies in the world. And I think that's more than enough exposure for retail clients. Anything other than that is getting into pretty specific trading strategies. And like Tim said, how could someone possibly imagine how they would value things like intellectual property and whatever? So yeah, I would say veering away from trying to pick individual tech stocks and going for the sector as a whole is probably more balanced for clients.